When Norman Mailer had a chance to read the book that we're going to talk about today, it is called Film as a Subversive Art by Amos Vogel. Mr. Mailer said, and I'm quoting him verbatim, "I think it must be the most exciting and comprehensive book I've seen on avant-garde, underground, and exceptional commercial film. The still pictures are so well chosen that their effect is cumulative and powerful." That's Norman Mailer. Well, the book is one that I've been reading for some time. Usually when one reads for review or for purposes of an interview, one spends a few hours, but this one I've been reading on and off for a couple of months now. And my guest is Amos Vogel, whom you've met on these programs before. He's founder director of Cinema 16, America's most famous film society, and he's on the faculty of Harvard at the university here in town, the Annenberg School, and he contributes to the New York Times and the Village Voice. And I'm glad you're here.
Thank you. So am I.
I want to talk with you about the film experience. I want to talk, especially since in Philadelphia we have some people who are trying to do away with the what Desmond Ryan refers to as the porn brokers, and I think somebody else referred to it as the pornocopia of film that one finds in town. What do we call subversive art in film to start with? How do we define it?
Well, I define it as subversion both of form and of content. Usually people talk about it only in terms of content, in the sense that they're talking about films that in some way attempt to undermine, or to put it differently, to change existing value systems, existing views that people may have about one subject or another. But what I'm trying to do in my book is to indicate the subversion both of content and of form. Form being how the new cinema changes and completely subverts the old cinema in a great many different ways. I mean, the films that are now important, of course, are completely different in terms of style than the films that were made, say, 20, 30 years ago. So there is a subversion going on there, a changing, an attempt at creating something new, attacks on the narrative, on time, on space, on the very image itself. There are films that are being made nowadays without cameras. There are films without subject matter.
Do you want to go over that again? What is a film without a camera?
Well, there are films that are hand-painted directly onto the film, and each frame is slightly different from the one that precedes it, the result becoming a film when projected, becoming in many cases a very beautiful film. There's a famous Canadian animator by the name of Noel McLaren, who in fact is employed by the Canadian government as an avant-garde filmmaker, and several of his films are hand-painted on film, and there's no camera used whatsoever.
That's a twist.
There are also films without images that consist entirely of light or the absence of light in rhythmic succession, and which have a kind of semi-hypnotic effect on the spectator. There are films there are attempts in all areas to change and to go beyond what has been done before. You know, the Hollywood films of the 1930s and 40s are not the last word in cinema. It's a form of expression, an art form with artists attempting to say new things, just as they do in any other art form. Now, the second variety of subversion, what really might be referred to in a different way as consciousness changing, you know, is the subversion of content. And there, of course, we're talking not merely about the obvious things such as sex and politics, because there are films, of course, in every country that attempt to subvert the existing government establishment. And I'm not only talking about the West, but the East as well. But in addition to that, there are films that address themselves to fundamental taboos, visual taboos, very fundamental experiences of human beings, in fact. That's one of the fascinating aspects of it, that because they're fundamental, seem to be forbidden. I'm referring to, needless to say, not only sex, but birth. death, our attitude towards God. Now there you've got it. I mean, these are the most fundamental things we know of, right? And for some reason, over the centuries, there have been taboos, which of course are constantly in the process of changing. And this is what we're witnessing nowadays, and this undoubtedly is disturbing to many people, which is another way of saying that these films succeed in being subversive, because indeed they undermine what other people hold dear or consider holy.
And those people do not have the power to be tolerant enough, to be compassionate enough to let those who do not have the same convictions let this kind of subject sink in.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent way of putting it.
You talk about the power of the visual taboo. For instance, here's a lady, you say sacrilege remains attractive as long as God is still considered a worthy opponent. And I'm not sure what the film is. I think it says The Bed. Oh, that's the title of it. 1967, 8 years ago. The lady is lying there in the altogether with a Bible across her lower extremities. It is a Bible, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes.
This would upset most Americans.
Right. And this is precisely
to the point
why
of taking a picket sign in hand, probably.
Right. This is precisely why the filmmaker put it there. He wanted to upset and to call into question something, that previously had been held, not only previously, I mean, that had been considered holy. He wants to attack it. Now, there's a very famous surrealist film made by Buñuel, who is still around at the age of 80, making wonderful films. But his very first film had a very important image in the history of cinema, namely, or rather sequence, the slicing of a woman's eyeball on camera. Now, of course, this was, needless to say,
it's in your book,
imitated.
By the way, isn't it?
Yeah,
yes.
It is. But there was a very direct attempt as part of the surrealist movement in the 1920s to, as they put it, shock the bourgeoisie. And indeed, they shocked the spectator out of their wits with this sequence, because everybody expected it to end just before that razor was going to start slicing across that lady's eye, and it didn't.
Forgive me for interrupting, is it an anticipatory shock? Does he lead you up to that point?
Yes, he leads you up to it.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And not only does he lead you up to it, but he leads you through it, which makes it particularly effective. And this, of course, has become one of the images of cinema. I mean, no one can get away from that image. And in fact, even if you've seen the film many times, you remain shocked. The eye is a very important organ. This is how we see the world. And to have this portrayed to us, its violation, is a very fundamental human violation, in fact. And Hollywood, by the way, or television, never does that, or rarely does this kind of thing. You see, it attempts to protect us, because if we are not protected, and if we are not kept in a mollified and sort of semi-stupefied manner, we don't come back and pay again at the box office, you know what I mean? There has to be some protection of the audience. And this is, however, not true of these so-called subversive filmmakers, because they intentionally set out to confront you with some reality that you would like to not think about or not see. And then they hope that by making this reality visible, which after all is a human reality, the only realities we can show are things that, are human. By making it visible, they hope to make us, as you so correctly put it before, more tolerant, more human perhaps, because we should be able to see whatever human beings do. There should be no reason why this is not feasible. On the other hand, if you are upset by it, if one is upset by it, then one needn't go to see it. No one is forced to go to the movies, right? Or to look at a television program.
But that's an age-old argument. I think some people like to be forewarned.
I have no objection to forewarning people. For example, when we show a film here at the Cinematheque, that contains an excessive amount of, say, violence, although I would not show the kind of violent films that are being shown now that come out of Hollywood. I'm talking about violence that's organic to the story, but nevertheless violent.
You would not show Kung Fu?
No, I would not. In any case, in such a case, we forewarn the audience, yes. And even in terms of, say, sexually explicit films, I would indicate that these films are suggested for, adults. Mm-hmm. I would indicate it. Now, this is very different from the rating system, which pretends to be an advisory system, but in reality has two categories that make it the equivalent of censorship, self-censorship, namely R and X. I am not allowed, to take my child to see certain films.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also, I'm afraid that censorship or that kind of rating service speaks with a forked tongue.
Absolutely.
Because I noticed that Murder on the Orient Express had the same rating, I think, as Amarcord.
Yeah.
Was it Amarcord? I'm not sure, or Night Porter, one or the other, but it just made no sense at all.
Well, you're absolutely right about that, yes. And there's a constant attempt, to get the best possible rating, which is the G rating, because that means anybody can come, right? And the more people come, the more money you can make. At the same time, you attempt to get away with as much as possible, and, there's jockeying and...
I just wondered, who are the exhibitors who show the kind of film that we're talking about in your book, Film as a Subversive Art? Where does one see one of these films?
Well, first of all, in this book, I talk about 600 or 700 films, and a great many of these are large Hollywood or commercial major films that are being shown commercially, in regular theaters. Secondly, the other types of films, the, say, political films, documentaries, avant-garde films, offensive films of the type we have discussed before, these are shown in film societies, civic organizations. You'd be absolutely amazed at the number of outlets there are for films of this sort all over the country. Labor unions, churches are very active in that. Mm-hmm. Colleges, of course, are primary source for this kind of material, and there are literally hundreds of distributors who handle films of this sort.
The book is just tremendous. I couldn't be more excited, but the pictures even more so. You must have had the time of your life making selections. On the other hand, you were probably frustrated because you couldn't get as many in as you wanted to, despite the multiplicity of pictures.
Well, I've been collecting, of course, images in one way or the other, either by looking at them or physically collecting them for all my life. And the pictures in the book, there are about 400 of them, are only a small sampling of both what I have and, for that matter, what exists. Because needless to say, when you take a still to represent a motion picture, that's really an illusion itself, because in 1 second of film, you have 24 different images. Now, you can imagine a 90-minute film, how many images you run into then, right? And here we have one still to illustrate a film,
My guest today is Amos Vogel. He teaches and lectures at Harvard and at the Annenberg School of Communications at Penn, and his book, which is just out, published by Random House, is called Film as a Subversive Art. And if you are at all intrigued with motion pictures, I hope that you get yourself a copy. It's been carefully designed to challenge your perceptions and to test the limits of your tolerance, if you will. And I'm going to be subversive and do a commercial or two, if you don't mind. Then I'll be back. We're at the Museum of Art, and by the way, if you haven't been here, these are the last few weeks to see a marvelous exhibition of silver, which you'll find on the second floor. And I'll tell you more about that in the days to come. There's a friseur at the Penn Towers, 18th and JFK Boulevard, who believes that all women today should have hair that moves, that isn't tortured into unnatural shapes or sprayed into fixed position. How many people have gone out with women? It seems to me if we all die, we'll see on their lips that then one statement, close the door, pull the window up, or there's a draft. because their hair is sprayed to look like a mummy. Anyway, hair that fits the head with as much casual grace and flair as the right dress fits the body. This is the kind of hair that you'll find being done by the people at Jeans Tower West. And the people at Jeans Tower West here in town are fiercely determined to show that not only the new looks but positive signs of what he describes as a deep awareness should be evident in anybody's hairdo. And you can get an appointment there like this by calling LO76550. There's no prima donna treatment. You can just come right in. It is a realistic salon at a convenient address. It couldn't be more convenient because they're at 18th and Kennedy Boulevard. And they can take you before or during or after work on your lunch hour with hours to suit men and women alike. Should have said that earlier. Convenient, they're centrally located at 1825 Kennedy Boulevard, and it is Jeans Penn Towers West. Gene, Jeans Penn Towers West. And they specialize in quick hair design appointments. You can call them at Locus 76550 for yours. Jeans Penn Towers West. And you won't look plastic when you come out of there, I guarantee. You know, we've talked about Mather Insurance on these programs for a long time, and I'm glad to remind you that Mather & Company is over 100 years old, and I suppose that means, among other things, that Mather has had over 100 years of trustworthy experience as insurance brokers, over 100 years of developing worldwide facilities for handling your complete insurance needs, and over 100 years of building a staff of experts who are professionally trained to answer those complex insurance questions that very often come up in business. And so if you have a question about insurance, I suggest you call Mather. Incidentally, among other things, they can devise for you an insurance program for your company that is safe and dependable and certainly up to date. That you'll find in the bargain that you've realized untold savings in your time and money. But as I've said a million times, those more than 100 years can't do a thing for you unless you give Mather a call. And their number is Walnut 50118. That's Mather & Company. My guest today is Amos Vogel, who has written a fascinating book called Film as a Subversive Art. If you're just joining us, we're at the Museum of Art on the classical music stations, WFLN AM and FM, NBC in Philadelphia. I can't find the page, but when I saw the reference to a film that pokes a bit of fun at our funeral establishments. Do you recall the film?
Oh, The Loved One.
Yes, that I saw, I recall. I thought there was reference to another one, too.
Oh, yes, there are many, yes.
Again, this is a
yes.
This is a no-no in our language. One doesn't poke fun at that.
Well, it's really even more complex than that. Death in our civilization, unlike many others, is a secret, and we are kept away from it. And there are many psychiatrists nowadays. We don't die.
We pass away.
Yeah. We don't even know how we are born, and we don't know how we reproduce. At least as far as our senses are concerned. And it's a secret, and there are a great many psychiatrists nowadays and social scientists who feel that we are not doing us a service in keeping it such. It should be treated somewhat differently. Now, one way of making it more human, you might say, is returning to an earlier stage where death occurred, in the family, and people were aware of it. And a situation very different from the kind of establishments, commercial, exploitative, profit-making establishments that profit from other people's death, really, that exist nowadays. So there are people around who are attacking this, and in the process of attacking it, are also, in a sense, recalling us to a more dignified way of, more human, I should say, not dignified, more human way of dealing with this whole problem, Death is part of life, right? And I think, for example, to me, if you want to talk about obscenity, one of the obscenities of our lives is not the portrayal of sexual acts, something that all of us do and not only are happy about. It's one of the most delightful things we know as human beings. One of the obscenities is that when somebody dear to you dies, what you go through in order to get the right kind of coffin and the right kind of funeral and all of this connected with money.
That's the
an
obscenity, yes.
Yes.
I was looking at something in Esquire, the February issue, and there are a number of undertakers who, I should think if they had a public relations council, they would be told to be a little more quiet about this kind of thing. But here's a lady who was a funeral director, and she said, "When I die, I want my funeral done," this is her word, "elegantly. I want a cement vault, a fine casket with cedar. I will be laid out in elegant clothes because I love soft, beautiful things. I love jewelry. I want to be laid out in my jewelry." This is from a woman who is in business, who apparently is a successful lady.
Mm-hmm.
And again, this is an obscenity of a kind. People are starving all over the world.
Yes.
And this is, I don't think it's the norm for Americans, but there are just too many of us who are still indulging ourselves in this kind of alleged luxury.
Yes.
Luxury for whom, I wonder? For the remaining family? Those who stay behind?
I think it's a kind of ego trip, a retroactive ego trip. A bit late, but it's never too late.
I heard that when the loved one was released, 8 years ago, whenever it was, that there were lobbies in the country who tried to suppress it.
Yes.
And one can imagine who they were.
Yes, of course, yes. But you see, this is, it's as I said, it's really part of this larger question of, are we able to confront ourselves the way we really are? For instance, there was a very shocking, very disturbing, and I think very important film made by a young American avant-gardist who is internationally known by the name of Stan Brakhage. He went into an autopsy room and made a documentary as to what goes on there. Now, this is the kind of thing, obviously, that you wouldn't, see in prime time on national television.
Not in Philadelphia.
It's very hard, not in New York. It's very hard to take, and at the same time, it does demystify, the human being and shows us for what we are. Just in the same manner in which, say, medical students have a somewhat different approach to the human body than the rest of us.
Doesn't that boil down, though, to the definition of entertainment? Most people, and I think now that we're in a recession, or I think admittedly we're in a phase where people do not have the funds to go out for dinner as often as they had, or to see legitimate theater. And people resort to the movies again more than they have for entertainment. Don't we talk about people who really want to be amused and
but
they want laughs and music?
Look, I don't mean to give the impression that I would like all theaters suddenly to show films about autopsies. I discuss it in my book because it is part of one of the taboos that has to be discussed. But this whole question of entertainment is to me a very strange one, because to me the most entertaining thing is at the same time the most artful. That means I think that Charles Dickens or Dostoevsky or Beethoven, just to mention a few names, and not too controversial names, right, are more entertaining than some third-rate soap opera or the type of pap that's being presented so much of the time on television, for example.
This is the noun pap.
In our age, I don't consider that very entertaining. I think it's very insidious. It's subversive in its own way. It makes people be dead while they're alive. That's a very bad state. I would like people to wake up, and that's one reason why I favor, films that will attempt to change people's consciousness. But that can be the most entertaining thing in the world.
Tired old statement. I'm almost apologetic to throw it at you. But don't you agree to a certain point that the networks are really giving the masses, quote unquote, exactly what they want?
No. I think that the masses have never really been offered alternatives. What I mean by that is, if there were certain other types of programs, more in line with what I've been talking about here, and if these programs were shown in prime time with the same amount of advertising and publicity preceding it, I think that after a period of time, without a doubt, I have no doubt, such programs would indeed be acceptable and would indeed be viewed.
You think the attention span for a Dickensian 60 minutes...
For what?
For a Dickensian program of some kind would be as broad the appeal would be as broad as it would be for, I don't know, for the comedy hour.
Well, let's put it this way. This has never been proven or researched. To put it differently, the alternative has really never been meaningfully presented, and I refuse to believe that you and I are superior beings, superior to the rest of the people. I think that's an elitist view which is not tenable. And I think that if the alternatives were presented, that there would be much greater acceptance of this type of programming, but they are not accepted.
You see,
And there are reasons for that too, by
sure.
the way. For instance, in Great Britain, you know, the television is state-produced, government-produced, BBC. Now there they have much more interesting, far superior programming, which in fact we are now using more and more particularly in our educational stations.
Yes.
Now, there too you have the people, right, and the so-called elite, and yet it is possible to do more interesting programming. Why? Because the power of the sponsor, again, you know, the source that provides the money, which in America prevents the programming of anything that may be even faintly controversial and thereby antagonize a small portion of the potential market, you see. In Britain, this does not exist in this form, so that more imaginative programming is possible. At the present time, for instance, we are, I would say, privileged to see an outstanding, not just intellectual drama on television here, but also an outstanding film, namely The Ascent of Man, that whole series that's now on educational television. And
I wonder whether I'm more of a realist than you are.
yes,
But I have a feeling that the guy, and I'm talking about
Yes.
our neighbors, you know, people we see on the
Yes.
street every day, the man who drives a bus all day long,
Yes.
or pushes a beer truck, or maybe he sells something. He's had a horrendous day, and
Yes.
I just don't think that unless he's been prepared for this in school, whether it's 10, 20, or 30 years ago,
yes.
that he's any more willing to look at that kind of presentation than he is willing to listen to the Philadelphia Orchestra playing Beethoven.
Yes.
Because to him this
These-
is almost an affront.
Well, I don't think these things can be looked at in a vacuum. You're absolutely right. I think that in terms, it depends on your schooling, your upbringing, the influence of your parents. All of these things come into that kind of final, ultimate decision as to what one considers entertainment, you know. But I think that there ought to be alternatives. Again, I'm not forcing anyone to go and see them, but I would like there to be alternatives available to people. And that's, of course, one reason for the Cinematheque I'm running at the Annenberg Center, because I'm showing films there that, generally speaking, are not being shown in Philadelphia,
How do
including many
people
of the
see
films in
those?
this
For
book.
those who haven't heard you say this before,
Pardon me?
how do people see the Cinematheque
Oh, they
presentations?
just call the Annenberg Center and get on our mailing list. We also advertise, and you buy tickets. In fact, it's quite inexpensive. And we show a very large number of films, including many of the films in this book, by the way.
May I say again, it's a terribly exciting book, and we veered pretty far from the point, but it is called Film as a Subversive Art, and the author is Amos Vogel, who is active at the Annenberg School and Harvard as well. He's on the faculty of both. My thanks to you. Film as a Subversive Art.